having me. I feel very at home here. And I noticed that you do things similarly here than we do, except for backwards. I mean, we read the prayer book from left to right, and we do the announcements at the end, so everything is a little upside down, but it's somewhat the same. So there was once a great Rebbe. He was called the Sansa Rebbe, and he was famous. So Hasidim, or disciples, would travel long distances to go sit at his feet. And one of these disciples, a Hasid, was traveling, and he had many miles to go. So he stopped along the way at the Beit Midrash, or the house of study, of another Rebbe, another rabbi. And the rabbi there said, listen, you've got a long way to go to the Sansa Rebbe, but really, why don't you just stay here and study? Because what is it that they're teaching you there that you couldn't learn right here? And the chassid said, well, actually, they are teaching us something there that we couldn't learn elsewhere. And the rabbi said, what? He said, well, we're learning to read minds. To read minds? You mean you could read my mind? Mm-hmm. Okay. What am I thinking right now? And the chassid said, you are thinking that we are surrounded by the divine presence now and always. And the rabbi said, no, that's not what I was thinking. And the chassid said, and that's why I'm going to the sunset. So this is why we come here to Unity or to the Havarah, right? Because we sense that it's filled with spirit and holiness, right? We feel the divine here, right? And I'm here to talk about the divine presence in stories. Now, I didn't always think that was true. I didn't always know that. And I'm filled with the divine presence now of some friends who are in the audience, some people who are special kind of helpers to me along my path. So that's really special, too. When I first started telling stories, I didn't really understand that. I thought I was telling stories because they're fun. And it's true, storytelling is fun, right? But I started feeling that there was something more. All right? I started getting the sense that when my audiences were listening, I could really tell that storytelling was going on and reaching them on a deeper level. There's kind of a trance that happens in an audience, right? Because storytelling is actually a contact sport, right? I'm giving you something, but you're also feeding it back as you receive it. And I could feel that people were receiving it on different levels. And I began to read like Jung and Bruno Bettelheim and to read about how stories are not necessary to the psychic development of children and that we identify with archetypal characters and so on. And then I began reading Women Who Run with the Wolves, and Clarissa Pinkola Estes said, the story you choose to tell is the blueprint for your next phase of psychic development. I thought, yes. And I began to feel actually like the stories, though, were choosing me. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Psychic development, maybe it's not just psychic development. There's something larger than that going on, not just the psychological level. Now, in Judaism, we have a lot of Kabbalistic interpretation. This is the Kabbalistic tree of life. And we call it the four worlds. And that's another seminar. I'm not going to tell you all about the four worlds, but I'm going to simplify it to the levels of, because it's pretty easy to understand, body, heart, mind, and soul, right? So everything goes on those levels. So we feel, when we experience something, we can experience it in our body with our senses, and then with our heart, with our feelings. We can understand it with our mind, but then there's that mystery level, the subliminal, what we call the soul level. And in storytelling, it's like that as well. The body level, the physical level, or the pshat level, as we call it in Judaism, is the level of the plot in a story, right? What's happening? the twists and the turns, and that's kind of the physical level of the story. And then, of course, there's the heart level. There's the way that we feel the characters and the emotions in the story, the way that we identify with them. And then we've got the mind level. Stories teach us things. They teach us lessons, right? We learn from stories. And we do that with our head. But we kind of listen with our hearts. It's actually been shown that when you start to listen to a story, your brain switches to another mode. And we might call that right brain instead of left brain. But that's what I call listening with the heart instead of the head. But then we get that other level, that mysterious level. And when I started telling Jewish stories in a spiritual context, that spiritual level began to permeate my exploration of the stories. And I began to prepare stories for High Holy Days, and I was really aware that a new story would choose me, depending on what I needed to work on a psychological level, but also on a much higher level. So it was my way of preparing for the High Holy Days. And also, you've heard of poetic license. Well, I actually have a storyteller's license. And that means that I can play with stories, I can combine stories, and I can change stories, and I can play with the divine presence in them if I like, and I can bring in a little more of the divine feminine, right? So a lot of the Jewish stories are Baal Shem Tov stories. Now the Baal Shem Tov was a holy rabbi back in the 16th century, and of course, stories reflect the culture of the time. So these are all stories about men, okay? And they're all stories about men having holy revelations. Well, enough of that. So the story that I'm going to tell you this morning is a combination of a Baal Shem Tov story about a boy who plays the flute and another story. And I put them together, and I call it The Shekhinah is in Exile. And I'll tell you what the Shekhinah is in a moment. It's actually the female divine presence. But as I said, I tell stories at High Holy Days, and so there's a little something you need to know before I tell this story. And on High Holy Days, on Yom Kippur, that's the Day of Atonement, right? Now you've heard of that, some of you. Many of you are nodding your heads because half of you are probably Jewish anyway. Right? Anyway, on Yom Kippur, at the culmination of Yom Kippur, and this is a day when we fast, right? So we really ignore the body, and we try to really take those prayers into our heart and our soul. It's kind of the whole beginning of the year. We do what we call a chesbon nefesh. We really do an inventory of the soul. And the culmination, at the very end, everything kind of ascends, and then the gates of heaven open, metaphorically, right? And all of the prayers are lifted to heaven. Now, at the Havarah, we kind of do it David Gabriel style. We take out, at the end of Yom Kippur, right, we take out all of the chairs, we take out all of these drums, and we start drumming and dancing as the gates of heaven open, and we just sort of chant and dance and drum our way in. But we're not going to do that today. Well, who knows, maybe you will afterwards. But this story, this is The Shekhinah is in Exile. And afterwards, what I want to do is lead you through a little visualization to take you into what I call the story medicine for you, the soul level. So every Friday night here at the Havarah, on Shabbat, which is the Sabbath, we welcome the Shekhinah, the female presence of God. We face this door right here, and we metaphorically picture. We call it the Shabbat Queen, or the Shabbos Bride. We picture this female divine presence coming right through the door and into our hearts. And we have to invite the Shekhinah, she who dwells within, but she's not always really manifesting within us, or we're not always aware of it. So we invite her in for a special day, for Shabbat, the day of being, not doing. Now, it's easy to feel the presence of the Shekhinah, the divine flow, right? It's easy sometimes, like if we're out in nature and we see a rainbow, or we touch a tree, or we feel a drop of rain on our cheeks. Then we feel connected to the divine flow in nature and in everything. That's the Shekhinah. And that feeling of connectedness to the divine flow is what we seek here in prayer, in song, in meditation, even in dance, in any of the work we do. If we're really, really connected to it, then we feel that divine flow. And feeling unconnected is kind of the worst thing, right? But it comes and goes, right? So when I was getting this story ready, I had a little, let's say, a visit from the Shekhinah, because I was feeling pretty unconnected, and Yom Kippur was coming up, and I needed to put something together. But I was down in my office, and suddenly, it was Shabbat Shuvah, the Shabbat of return. It's a special day before Yom Kippur, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I was in my office, and I was sort of dancing and howling and weeping. It was sort of like women who run with the wolves meets the inner child under the direction of the Holy Shekhinah. So here's the story. Once there was a man and his wife who wanted a child. More than anything, they prayed for a child. And eventually, they were blessed with a baby. But it wasn't exactly what they wanted. They wanted a boy, and this was a girl. And as this little girl grew, it became apparent that she was a very unique and wild child. She was always running around and stamping her feet and howling and tearing things up and racing outside and climbing trees and tearing her clothes and getting everything dirty and bringing home stray animals. She was a real wilde chaya, a wild thing. And they couldn't control her. She never wanted to be indoors. She was always outside. She was climbing trees. She was talking to trees. She was talking to animals. She hardly ever talked to humans. But she had a little wooden flute. And whenever she got excited or passionate about something, she would take out that flute and blow. And the most beautiful music would come out. But she played in all the wrong places. They couldn't take her anywhere. They certainly couldn't keep her in school, because if a butterfly flew by the window, she would race outside. And if it was time to be quiet and study or read, she would take out her flute and play music. And they certainly couldn't take her to synagogue, because when the prayers were exciting, she would take out her flute and disturb everybody. Now, as she got older, one year Yom Kippur was coming up, and her parents thought, well, maybe they should try again. Maybe as she was getting older, Yom Kippur would be a good time for her to sit quietly. This would be good for her soul. And so they brought her to the shul, the synagogue, with strict instructions to sit properly and listen quietly. You're laughing, but she did. She sat very quietly, and she listened carefully. But then when the prayers began to get more beautiful and lyrical and to move her heart, she reached for her flute. She couldn't help it. And her father reached over and said, no. And so she was quiet for a while longer. But then the prayers began to get more intense, and then there was dancing and there was singing, and she couldn't help herself. She reached for that flute again, and this time her father reached over and he took the flute away from her. And she sat in silence. But then the prayers began to get even more lyrical, and things began winding up towards the ascent to the gates of heaven. And she couldn't control herself. She was so excited. She reached over to grab her flute, but her father grabbed her, and he picked her up out of the seat, and he led her out of the synagogue. And he led her to a clearing behind the synagogue. And he said, stay here. You can play your flute. Wait here. And he went back into the shul. But as soon as he got back in, he could see that there was something wrong. The rabbi, who was supposed to be finishing the service at this point, was not doing that. Instead, he was kind of pacing back and forth in front of the bima and muttering to himself. Well, you know, the people there had been there all day long, and they had been fasting, so they were exhausted and they were starving. So one of them went up to the rabbi and said, "Rabbi, what's wrong? Why aren't you finishing the service?" And he said, I don't know. I mean, something's wrong. Something's missing. I don't know. Something's missing. What's missing? I can't explain it. I'll explain it with a story. And this is what he said. He said, there was once a king and a queen who had an only daughter, the princess, who was beloved in the community. And when it was time for her to be married, they had a huge wedding. And they invited everyone in the community. And they sent everyone an invitation that promised a lavish wedding with a huge feast. But unfortunately, a few days before the wedding, the princess took ill and she died. Well, everyone in the community was in mourning. Everyone, that is, except for one man who showed up on the day of the wedding, banging on the palace gates, demanding the 5-course dinner that was promised on the wedding invitation. Now the rabbi turned to his congregants and he said, "Do you want me to be like that boorish guest, banging on the palace gates, demanding to be admitted to the celebration when the princess is dead? Do you want me to stand here at the gates of heaven and demand entry? How can I? How can I when the Shekhinah is in exile?" Well, now, nobody in the congregation had any idea what he was talking about. They didn't get it, except for the girl's father. And he got up and he went out and he found his daughter crouching under a tree, playing her flute softly. And he beckoned to her and he took her by the hand and he led her back into the synagogue. And as they walked in, everyone turned. And the young girl brought that flute to her lips. And she began to play. And the music came out, sweet and slow and full of the tears of deepest sorrow and full of the laughter of angels. And the music rose, and the music filled the room with the voices of the ancestors and the voices of all the women, Kolei Hanashim. And the music soared higher and higher, and the music lifted all of those prayers, all of the prayers in the hearts of all of the people, lifted them straight up to heaven. And that's the Shekhinah is in exile. I could see by a lot of wiping eyes that it reached you deeply, and I want to go a little deeper if you'll indulge me by closing your eyes, and I'm going to lead you through a visualization. Why not? Here we are, right? In story world. So just feel yourself here in this room, even while the images of the story are floating through your mind. Feel your breathing. Feel your body on the chair. Feel the way your body rises and falls as you breathe. Feel your heart and all the thoughts and just be with them for a moment. I want you to allow the images from the story to float through your mind. See what you see. And I want you to imagine that one of the characters in the story is appearing in your mind's eye. It doesn't have to be a major character. Anybody. Maybe somebody who wasn't even seen. Don't censor it. Whoever appears is whoever wants to appear. Now imagine that that character is beckoning to you, taking you by the hand, and is going to lead you someplace in the story. Maybe a place that you hadn't seen before, or someplace that you need to look at more closely. And now imagine that that character is going to whisper in your ear and tell you a secret. That's your own story medicine. Something that you need to know. Just for you. Listen carefully. And you can dialogue, you can ask questions of your story guide. Maybe you don't understand something or you want to know more. When you think you've heard enough, then thank the character, say goodbye, and feel yourself back in your own mind with that new information, that new wisdom from the highest level, or the deepest level. And feel yourself back in the room. And when you're ready, open your eyes. And I'm wondering if anybody would be, this is what we do in the Havara, but I don't know if anybody here would be willing to share something that they learned. Tamara, right?
Yeah.
Please.
I saw the little girl with the flute, and I noticed that when she led me back to her seat in the service, my question was why are we so quick to shun others and honoring themselves in their own truth? And I noticed that my answer was, it's about us honoring our own truth individually and one on.
Thank you. Somebody else? Yeah.
I was the girl playing the flute for everybody else, and I've done that all my life, made everybody happy and joyful. But the sadness that came over me when I saw that, I was under the tree, and she came and played for me finally, and she said that it's okay to grieve, but only for a little while. To be able to take the grief and turn it into a joke. I've been watching Joe Rivers last night, and I figured out taking tragedy and turning it into comedy. You can do it for everybody else, Anne-Marie, why can't you do it for you? And so that was my lesson.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I was picturing that flute player under a pine tree, and before I was actually thinking about her before you said to think about it.
Yeah.
But I've been having a lot of weird things. I'm under a lot of stress, and it's almost like my body is turning on me, and I'm having like health stuff. And I've been trying to figure out like what do I need to change with my diet. And I smelled honeydew melon. It was a really strong smell of honeydew melon. And so I'm going to go buy honeydew melon today.
Let me know how that goes. Okay, that's a very specific.
Yeah.
Okay. Marvin?
Yeah. I visualize the father as my father. And all my life he was very critical and didn't know how to yell or scream. And in this case, he told me that he loved me, but he didn't know how to show it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and one more here. Yeah. Go ahead.
I had the mother who had like this kind of thing on her head, and she said, Batya, have patience. I don't know.
What is your name?
Elizabeth?
Elizabeth. Oh. Well, you know, Batya, and you know who Batya was in the Bible? She was the one. This is interesting because this is Passover season and Easter season, right? Batya was Pharaoh's daughter. That's I guess the Hebrew name of Pharaoh's daughter. So she's referred to in our liberation story as Batya, and she is the one who takes the baby Moses and cares for him, right? Adopts him and allows him to live. So she's also, you know, she's sort of a midwife of the soul, right? And by the way, when I told David I was going to tell the story of the Shekhinah's in exile, I said, oh, it's the high holy days. By the way, I didn't tell you that I'm a Virgo and a perfectionist. I said, it's for high holy days and it doesn't fit. And he said, no. All stories fit everywhere, which is true. But because the Shekhinah is in exile, he said, this is spring. This is the time of Passover. It's our liberation from exile. And it's the time of Easter, which is the resurrection, right? So we're all coming out of exile. So it's interesting that you brought up Batya, who's part of that story. So you'll have to figure out the rest of what that means. Okay. Is there someone else who wants to share one more thing? Yeah.
I was curious what the little girl was feeling when she was under the tree and had been ostracized. And when I went up to her, she just was so content, and she said, you just can't stop yourself.
That's what she said to you. And you're an artist, right? A visual artist?
No, I'm a garden artist.
Okay, I got you mixed up with somebody else. But we can't stop ourselves from playing, and that's a really good message to end with. Once when I visualized this story, and by the way, you can do this with anything, right? To kind of allow that guide to bypass all the other head stuff, right? And get right down to whatever wisdom is out there for you. And at one time, the young girl, I was the young girl, right? And the father was beckoning to me, and I didn't want to go. It was like, I am very happy being here in exile. I don't necessarily want to join the world. I'm also an introvert. So, you know, it's interesting. I can tell stories and get different wisdom every time because stories have a long shelf life, believe me, with multi-layers. So I thank you so much for having me here, and I hope it's opened up some worlds for you. And I do have some of my CDs. My CD is called Return Again, because the stories are really stories for High Holy Days where we return to the land of our soul. But they're also really stories of transformation and growth. So, they're reduced from $16 to $14 because on Amazon you can get them for $13 plus shipping. So here you get an even better deal. And there's a little box there. And there's also some flyers because if you pre-order my memoir, Bringing Bubby Home, and by the way, Bubba is a guy in the mid with a gun, and Bubby, it means grandmother. I brought my 103-year-old grandmother home to live and die with us. That's what the book is about. And anyway, you can pre-order it at a great discount from White Cloud Press. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.